Fyodor+Mikhailovich+Dostoevsky. 1821 to 1881. Fyodor Dostoevsky is renowned as one of the world's greatest novelists and literary psychologists. An overview of his life. Born in Moscow in 1821, the son of a doctor, Dostoevsky was educated first at home and then at a boarding school. When Dostoevsky was a young boy, his father sent him to the St. Petersburg Academy of Military Engineering, from which he graduated in 1843. Dostoevsky had long been interested in writing, and he immediately resigned from his position as a sub-lieutenant to devote his time to his craft. His first book, Poor Folk, 1846, was immediately popular with critics. Dostoevsky's early view of the world was shaped by his experience of social injustice. At the age of 26, Dostoevsky became active in socialist circles, largely because of his opposition to the institution of serfdom. His political opinions were influenced by his experiences as a young boy. His father was murdered by his own serfs while Dostoevsky was away at school, another experience that greatly affected Dostoevsky, and that found its way into his writing, was the time he spent in prison. On April 23, 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested for his participation in a group that illegally printed and distributed socialist propaganda. After spending 8 months in prison, Dostoevsky was sentenced to death for membership in the group and was led, with other members of the group, to be shot. But the execution turned out to be a mere show, meant to punish the prisoners psychologically. Dostoevsky then spent 4 years at a labor camp in Siberia, followed by 4 years of military service. Raskolnikov's time in a Siberian prison, described in the epilogue of Crime and Punishment, is based on Dostoevsky's own experiences at a similar prison, and he devoted many passages in his other books to scenes involving criminal justice, including the courtroom scenes of the brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky's time in prison affected him in at least 2 important ways. First, during his imprisonment Dostoevsky began suffering from epileptic seizures, a condition from which he suffered for the rest of his life. He portrays the experience of epilepsy through the character of Smoryakov in The Brothers Karamazov. The second important change that Dostoevsky underwent in prison was his rejection of the radical socialist positions that had led to his arrest, and his development of a conservative concern for traditional values. His conservative religious and philosophical inclination is evident throughout his works written after this period, including The Brothers Karamazov. For instance, Dostoevsky specifically questions whether good and evil can exist in a world in which there is no God. Through the character of Rakitin, from The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky parodies the progressive theories of his contemporaries, intellectuals who move from popular idea to popular idea according to the whims of fashion, without regard for the truth. In 1857, Dostoevsky married Maria Dmitrievna Izieva, who died of consumption 7 years later. He spent much of the 1860s in Western Europe, experiencing the culture that was slowly invading Russia. During this time he struggled with poverty, epilepsy, and an addiction to gambling. But with the publication of Crime and Punishment, 1866, his fortunes improved. Crime and Punishment's popular and critical success allowed him to keep ahead, albeit just barely, of daunting debts and the burden of supporting a number of children left in his care after the deaths of his brother and sister. In 1867, he married a second time, to Anna Grigorievna Snikina, who helped him cope with his epilepsy, depression, and gambling problems. Anna had served as his stenographer for his novel The Gambler, 1867. After writing Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot, 1868, and perhaps his greatest masterwork, The Brothers Karamazov, 1880. The Brothers Karamazov is Dostoevsky's deepest and most complex examination of crucial philosophical questions of human existence. In it, he addresses the conflict between faith and doubt, the problem of free will, and the question of moral responsibility. The Brothers Karamazov is one of the greatest novels of the 19th century, and remains the capstone of Dostoevsky's achievement today. Dostoevsky died in 1881, less than 4 months after The Brothers Karamazov was published. He had intended it as part of a larger work to be called The Life of a Great Sinner. The book is written on 2 levels. Ostensibly, it is the story of a parricide in which all of a murdered man's sons share varying degrees of complicity, but, on a deeper level, it is a spiritual drama of the moral struggles between faith, doubt, reason, and free will. Some people have seen Dostoevsky's novels as prophetic depictions of life under the Soviet regime. The existentialist movement that took shape in the middle of the 20th century looked to him for his descriptions of human beings confronting mortality, despair, and the anxiety of choice. The novel's progress. Dostoevsky began his first notes for the Brothers Karamazov in April of 1878. Several influences can be gleaned from the very early stages of the novel's genesis. The first involved the profound effect the Russian philosopher and thinker Nikolai Fyodorovich Fyodorov had on Dostoevsky at this time of his life. Fyodorov advocated a Christianity in which human redemption and resurrection could occur on earth through sons redeeming the sins of their fathers to create human unity through a universal family. The tragedy of patricide in this novel becomes much more poignant as a result because it is a complete inversion of this ideology. The brothers in the story do not resurrect their father but instead are complicit in his murder, which in itself represents complete human disunity for Dostoevsky. Though religion and philosophy profoundly influenced Dostoevsky in his life and in The Brothers Karamazov, a much more personal tragedy altered the course of this work. Shaped by tragedy. In May of 1878, Dostoevsky's novel was interrupted by the death of his 3-year-old son Alyosha. As tragic as this would be under any circumstances, Alyosha's death was especially devastating for Dostoevsky because the child died of epilepsy, a condition he inherited from his father. The novelist's grief for his young son is readily apparent throughout the book. Dostoevsky made Alyosha the name of the stated hero of the novel, as well as imbuing him with all of the qualities he himself most admired and sought after. This heartbreak also appears in the novel as the story of Captain Sneguryov and his young son Ilyusha. True crime and true innocence. A very personal experience also influenced Dostoevsky's choice for a parricide to dominate the external action of the novel. In the 1850s, while serving his katorga, forced labor, sentence in Siberia for circulating politically subversive texts, Dostoevsky encountered the young man Ilyinsky who had been convicted of killing his father to acquire an inheritance. Nearly 10 years after this encounter, Dostoevsky learned that Ilyinsky had been falsely convicted and later exonerated when the actual murderer confessed to the crime. The impact of this encounter on the author is readily apparent in the novel, as it serves as much of the driving force for the plot. Many of the physical and emotional characteristics of the character Dmitry Karamazov are closely paralleled to those of Ilyinsky.